Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I will be discussing and reviewing The German Wife by Kelly Rimmer, which is a book that I did not expect to love as much as I did. I think it's always easier for me to explain why I didn't like something than it is to explain why I did, but I will give it my best shot. This book follows Sophie, who is the titular German wife, and her husband Jürgen and their children in the 1930s. As Hitler rises to power in Germany. It also follows the characters in a separate timeline that takes place in 1950. And this book is based on real-life events, specifically Project Paperclip, which was a top-secret program in the United States where Nazi scientists were brought to America in order to work on the rocket program. Even though she's not mentioned in the blurb of the book, there is another main character whose point of view we get, and that is Lizzie. And she grows up in America during the 30s and the Depression and the Dust Bowl. Eventually, through a series of events, she ends up moving to Huntsville, Alabama in the 1950s timeline where the rocket program is taking place. So this book basically shows how each of the characters, Lizzie and Sophie, go from one point in their life to another. It starts out with Lizzie being on a farm in Texas during the Dust Bowl, and she ends up in Huntsville, Alabama, where the rocket program is taking place because her husband is a part of it, and Sophie and her husband Jürgen begin the story in 1930s Berlin as Hitler rises to power and Germany begins to undergo a massive change, and their family is forced to deal with that. And then Sophie and her children are brought to Huntsville, Alabama, where Jürgen is working on the rocket program. And those are the two timelines of this story. As you can imagine, the Germans being brought to America was something that was not viewed very favorably by many Americans. Just the fact that the characters are German is enough to have them labeled as Nazis, whether they were Nazi sympathizers or not. And this is a very sad fact, because at the beginning, all of these German citizens were just caught up in everything that was going on with their country. And I think for us living in the timeline that we do now, it's easy for us to look back and judge and say they should have done more, but we have access to information at the blink of an eye, and these people didn't, and oftentimes by the time they found out what was going on, it was simply too late. But when Sophie moves to America to be with Jürgen, she is met with lots of hostility from the fellow women that she meets who are American rather than German. And even some of the German women end up shunning her because of Jürgen's involvement. Jürgen is a scientist, so he was recruited to work on the German rocket program. It was always his dream that one day a rocket would be sent to the moon, and at first that's how the rocket program was marketed. If Germany could be the first country to send a man to the moon, that would be a great accomplishment and a huge boost for morale, because of course Germany was still very much struggling from the harsh punishments that they were handed after the end of World War I. So if Germany could be the first country to send a man to the moon, it would be a huge plus for their country. But even though that's the way the rocket program was marketed at first, that is not how it stayed. Rather than simply being a space program, it eventually became clear that the Nazis intended to use this program as a weapon. They wanted to weaponize these rockets, and Jürgen and Sophie are forced to make very difficult decisions. Do they play along with what the Nazis want, even knowing that it's wrong and where this could eventually lead in order to keep their families safe? Or do they try to push back and stop all of this at the risk that their family might even be killed, because they do have their children to think of? And of course, even if you try to go along with things and just focus on what's most important, keeping your family safe, eventually that becomes untenable and you realize that something has to be done, and yet it also feels like it's too late because so much has already happened that is bad. Obviously, looking back, we know what the Nazis did, we know where this led, and I just felt very sorry for Jürgen and Sophie because they were forced to make such terrible, difficult decisions, and there really doesn't seem like a right decision to make. And so I completely understand why they felt trapped, and of course they felt horrible about the things that were going on, and yet when they come to America, the Americans don't see it that way. They're Nazis, of course, just because they're German. They had to be Nazis. They had to know what was going on. And so them being here isn't right, and they should be punished for what they did, because now they're allowed to come to America and just live free lives and not ever face any punishment for the wrong that happened. What I found particularly interesting is the progression of events in Sophie's timeline. where you see the Nazis progressively get worse, the laws that they pass that slowly strip people's rights away, which is quite frightening to see how easily that happens, and yet it happens slowly enough that people didn't really notice it, and by the time they did, it was too late to do anything. Of course, this was when people's personal homes and apartments began to be bugged so that they could listen to their conversations. If you planned on running away or you planned on sabotaging something or taking a stand and pushing back against the Nazis, they knew of your plans without you even realizing it. And that is terrifying. I think that we now just automatically ask, is my phone listening to me? But back then that wasn't really a thing. And it's scary to think that these characters really had no privacy anywhere, and they had to be very careful what they said and to whom, especially because you didn't know that you could even trust your own neighbors. Like, your neighbor could be spying on you. And that sadly did happen in real life. And despite their desire to protect their children, Sophie and Jürgen's children end up being indoctrinated into the Hitler Youth program. And even though one of Sophie's best friends is a Jewish woman who lives in their house with them because of personal family circumstances, these children grew up with Mayim in their house, and yet through the indoctrination of the Hitler Youth program, they come to view her as the enemy, they fear her, they worry that she's going to give them some horrible disease, and it's just frightening and almost unrealistic how easily these children were indoctrinated into believing something that was contrary to everything that they had learned up until that point. And Sophie and Jürgen were in the awful position of not being able to say anything against what they were being taught at school, because if they did, then they put their children's lives at risk and their own lives as well, because at this point the kids are so indoctrinated they might not even believe what they're telling them, and they could turn their parents into the Gestapo, which is a heartbreaking situation. On the other hand, we have Lizzie, who is growing up during the Dust Bowl. Her family farm is struggling because there is no rain. They just keep thinking that every year is going to be better than the last one, and it just never is. There's still no rain, the crops are failing, the prices are going down, and it being the Depression as well, everybody's struggling, so there's not as much money to go around. And eventually, of course, she loses the family farm and ends up moving away, and that is how she comes to be in Huntsville, Alabama, where the rocket program is. And she particularly does not like the Germans being in town. She does not like Sophie because Sophie uncomfortably points out that there isn't a great deal of difference between what the Nazis did with concentration camps and singling out Jews and what America is doing with segregation. And Lizzie is like, no way, that's crazy. They're no way the same, but the sentiment behind it is the same. The moment you single out a single group of people as somehow being less than, this is the slippery slope that you go down. And I think that it's interesting that even though that Lizzie and the other Americans felt that their hatred towards the German people were justified because of what they did, at the end of the day it's hate, and hate is what led everyone to this point. It's what let the Nazis get away with what they did in the first place. It's because they fed on hate, and hate of any kind is dangerous, but because we're hating Nazis, who are like the ultimate evil, it's okay. That's how Lizzie feels about this. And she also feels particularly vitriolic towards the Germans because of her brother Henry's experience. Henry, of course, entered the army, and he went over to Europe to fight, and the things that he saw and did there left him a broken, damaged man, and he's still trying to get back on his feet, but he can't hold down a job, and he's clearly struggling with PTSD, and of course back then the treatments were less effective than they might be now. PTSD is obviously a complex condition, and it can be difficult to treat it. Lizzie so desperately wants to help her brother, but she's not sure how, and at the end of the day, she might actually be holding him back more than she is helping him. But because the Germans did this to her brother, in her mind, she feels justified in hating them. And this natural tension between the Americans and the Germans in this town of Huntsville eventually leads to that tension boiling over. And the resulting act of violence brings us to the question of whether it is an act of vengeance or an act of justice. So I don't really want to get any more detailed than that because I want to avoid spoilers, but this book made me feel things, which is not very often. I read a lot of books and it's not often that they make me feel things, especially because this book is in first-person point of view. You get Sophie's point of view in her chapters and then Lizzie's point of view in her chapters, and I was just shocked. I was able to connect to all of the characters. I didn't feel that one side was particularly right over the other. I could understand where both were coming from and sympathize with each, especially Sophie. I was surprised by how much I felt for her and Jürgen, because even though they, of course, eventually became aware of what was going on, it was difficult not to, with Jürgen being so high up in the government working on this rocket program that was weaponized and eventually gave us the V2 rocket. There was nothing that they could ultimately do about it. Like I said, their decisions seemed impossible. What choice do they make? If they decide to just go along with things in the hope that their children will be spared, their children are still indoctrinated. The children believe that the Jews are the enemy and that all of this stuff is great, and it was just insane to me how brainwashed people became, how fanatical they became. People viewed Hitler as a god. They were willing to do anything for him. Anything. In fact, George, Sophie and Jürgen's son, ends up saying a prayer to Hitler, which is super creepy, and I can only assume that that is in fact based on real life because of the extensive research that the author clearly did for this book. It's just very creepy, and I just don't get it, because at the end of the day, of course, Hitler was just a person like anybody else. He was human. He was not a god, and that shows in the fact that the Nazis failed spectacularly at the end, and he ended up killing himself. And yet, there are some people who still, after the war, clung to their beliefs and the indoctrination that they had absorbed. They still thought that it was everything that they had promised that it would be, and I just don't see how you can see that. How you can still believe that after you just watched everything fall apart around you. I mean, at the end of the war, it was bad. People who lived in Berlin were told to barricade their homes and fight to the death for the Reich and all this stuff. And even the Hitler Youth were sent out to fight, and you had children being killed, because at the end, that's how desperate it became. And I don't know how you can look at all of that and think, yep, Hitler was right. No, absolutely not. But it's just the belief was so strong. The German people were so desperate to believe in something or someone. They were desperate to not be so beaten down like they had been ever since World War I. And it just led to this perfect storm, this perfect combination of all these elements. And you had this person who came on the scene who was charismatic and slowly chipped away. And if you weren't paying attention, suddenly you didn't recognize your own country anymore. And so I find that to be very interesting and very terrifying at the same time. I think part of why I sympathize with Sophie and Jürgen so much is that even though they knew some of the horrors of what was going on, they felt terrible about what had happened. Even though they themselves were not responsible, they still wished that they could have done more. But like I said, you have the option of keeping your head down and going along with things to protect your family, or you could try to stand up and say this is wrong, but you would just be killed or you'd disappear, no one would ever hear from you again, and then who would take care of their children? Who would try to tell their children that the things they're learning in school is wrong? They would just be left to be taken care of by this regime and indoctrinated even further. So there really is no good answer. Jürgen was very intelligent. He was a scientist that the Nazis needed for their rocket program. He could have said, no, I'm not going to help you because I fear what you're going to do with these rockets, but he wasn't irreplaceable. It would have been difficult, but there were men who could have replaced him. So it's not like him taking a stand and saying, no, absolutely not, would have suddenly somehow prevented the Germans from continuing with their rocket program. But this is the program that ended up creating the V2 rocket, and at the end they were using slave labor basically from some of the camps, specifically Mittelbau-Dora, I believe, and Jürgen was absolutely horrified at what he was seeing take place at this rocket facility. He saw the condition of the prisoners, and at the end of the day, more people died bringing the V2 rocket into being than were killed by the V2 rocket. So when they move to America, Jürgen and Sophie just want a chance to start over. They want a chance at a new life in America where they can be safe and they don't have to worry about being oppressed by a regime like they were in Germany, a place where their children can grow up and not be indoctrinated into this hateful narrative. And I do think that it's interesting that, of course, you never completely move on from something like that. It's going to haunt you forever. And one of the small ways that it does is when Sophie is questioned by the police in one scene, she's taken to the police station and they ask her questions in an interrogation room, and she is terrified. She's telling herself that this is okay, this is normal, they're not going to mistreat me, they're not going to lock me up and then forget me there like they do in Germany. It's okay, there are laws, there are processes, they can't just do whatever they want, and yet even knowing that, she's still afraid that that's exactly what's going to happen because that's the kind of thing that went on in Germany. I feel like it's really hard for me to express why I loved this book so much and why it impacted me without going into spoilers. I definitely understand why so much World War II fiction is written every year, and I will definitely be reading more of it. Obviously, not all of it is going to be the caliber that this book is, and I was especially surprised how good this book is because it was published by an imprint of Harlequin, and I thought this might very well be another Radar Girls situation, but it wasn't. It was very, very good. And I would even consider adding The German Wife to my bookshelf, which is the highest praise I can give a book, except I'm not sure it's the kind of book that I'd ever want to read again. It's very emotionally heavy. It makes you think. I think part of the reason why I love this book is not only is it historical, which I love history anyway, but it asks very difficult questions from a moral standpoint. What is the right thing to do in this situation? Should you stand up and say no, knowing that the Nazis are probably going to murder you, and then your death is just, that's it, you're dead, and what difference did you really make? I mean, at the end of the day, you're not complicit in these horrors that the Nazis are committing, but did you really accomplish anything other than keeping your own conscience clear at the end? It's just a very heavy-hitting conundrum to be in. What is the right decision to make? And it doesn't really seem black or white. It's like, especially for Jürgen and Sophie, they have a family to think of. They can't just think about themselves, because I'm sure if it was just the two of them, the decision wouldn't have been that difficult to make at all. But when you have young children that you're supposed to protect and look out for, how do you do that? How do you do that when it looks like possibly letting them believe a lie? How do you protect them from the lies? Can you protect them? It's just a very difficult thing to have to ask yourself, and I just can't even imagine what it would have been like for the people that actually lived through that. I feel like that is such a difficult thing, and I hope that in the future we never have to have a situation like that where we're forced to ask ourselves those very difficult questions. And I do think that the people who went through this must have been very tough people, because I can't foresee myself going through any of that, but then they probably couldn't either until they had to. So they had to either rise to the occasion or not. So that is all I feel that I can say about this book without going into very specific details, which is very spoilery and obviously would ruin the emotional impact of this book if you do choose to read it. But I highly encourage everybody to read it. This is a book that not only taught me a lot about World War II events, and that's just a huge topic to cover. So much happened in World War II, from the actual battles and the strategy to the government situation in Germany itself, which this book explores. There's just so much to World War II, and that also explains why so much is published on it all the time. But it definitely taught me about something I didn't know. I didn't know about Project Paperclip. I didn't know that there were Nazi scientists who were pardoned after the war, who had their slates essentially wiped clean as far as the official record goes, who were brought to the United States to work on the space program and were never really punished for what they'd done, at least not here in this life, in any court of law, and were ironically absolutely instrumental in the US getting a man to the moon. That only happened, in part, because of the Nazi scientists that were brought here. I had no idea about that, and it's just fascinating to have learned something about all of this and gone on this emotional roller coaster with these characters, and Kelly Rimmer just did an absolutely fantastic job at making you care about all of the characters. And I thought that her note at the end was particularly interesting, that her personal view on all of it, because she did a fantastic job at being a very unbiased narrator. She portrays all of her characters in a sympathetic light. You just feel sorry for all of them and wish that they had never had to be put in this position in the first place. But it is definitely not a light read, but it is extremely well done, and I was just blown away by it. So there you have it. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!